There's a line never crossed and there's no return. There's a time and a place, no bridges left to burn. The innocents were laying when in the end you failed to save them. To happy ending, then it turns out life was far less like possible odds. That's when you learn you've been messing with God. Sending a dream to crash, and we cannot when all you see is all you need. Right now the world just a childish dream. We decide our worlds. The story won't be told. And victory is inevitable.
Episode 15 picks up a few days later. Ruby, Blake, Yang, and Juniper, while at lunch, remark how Juniper has started to really show improvement. Carden, meanwhile, has become more aggressive with his bullying. Even his team looks bedraggled. In the background, we can see Weiss eating at a different table, alone, and Ruby stares at her sadly. Blake tells Ruby just to give up on Weiss. She's not the kind of challenge that's worth it. Yang, however, disagrees, saying that everyone deserves a second chance. Maybe Ruby has a point and there's actually something redeeming about Weiss. Yang then goes quiet, trying to think of an example before awkwardly proclaiming, I mean, she's rich. Blake gives Yang a blank stare and Ruby just rolls her eyes with a sigh. Their dialogue is cut short when Carden, on the other side of the room, begins bullying Velvet, this time far rougher than before by full-on yanking on her ears, to the point she stumbles under his grip. Blake, finally reaching a breaking point with the bully, begs John to use his leverage to help Velvet. John regretfully replies that he can't. His and Carden's ceasefire is too fragile to exploit, especially so soon after making it. Velvet isn't technically one of John's friends, and if he were to start including random people under that umbrella, Carden would most likely just snap and get them both expelled anyway. Blake is infuriated at John, glaring at him as she stands. Deciding to confront Carden herself, Blake walks over to them and gets Velvet out of his hands, guiding her back to the safety of their friends group. What follows is Blake and Carden getting into a screaming match, with Blake particularly needling him about his emasculation during the fight with the Ursa. Carden shoots back that if he's considered weak, what right does Velvet, a furball who doesn't even fight back, have to attend a school like Beacon? Blake bites back, more of a right than you, and this becomes a back and forth of escalated shouting. To everyone's surprise, Weiss steps in to back Carden's argument. She makes it clear that his behavior is boorish, but highlights Velvet's reluctance to stand up for herself as a casebook example of Faunus traits: docile, skittish, and weak-willed. It's quite well understood in Atlas, and at least there the academies put them in their place. It's a childish, misguided thought that Faunus could ever be on the same footing with typical humans, which is why activists like the White Fang quickly devolve into tantrum-throwing babies that need to use violence to get their way. Blake is stunned speechless by the arrogant and pointedly racist screed from Weiss. Yang stands up beside Blake and yells, "Weiss, you are way out of line, you're talking about our schoolmates!" Weiss immediately rebuffs Yang as a simpleton for not understanding the nuance of her position. Ruby, seeing the tempers rising rapidly, speeds out the door, and Pyrrha joins in the argument, contesting that Weiss's position isn't nuanced. If anything, it's overly simplistic. It's these words, from someone we know that Weiss respects, that gives her a pause, glancing around the cafeteria in confusion as the other students around them avert their eyes. However, Carden decides to pick things up for his side of the argument and reaffirms that Weiss knows what she's talking about. She's arguably one of the most intelligent people in their class, and he threatens to attack Pyrrha if she insults either him or Weiss again. John steps in and stares Carden down, saying, "I think we're done here." Carden's mouth snaps shut, but his eyes narrow. Still enraged, but somewhat toothless with expulsion on the line, he snarls at John that he can't protect his friends forever. And yeah, just a bit of foreshadowing there, you know? This is where Coco bursts into the cafeteria, the rest of Team Coffee hot on her heels, declaring that John won't have to protect them so long as Team Coffee is around. Ruby walks out from behind the group, out of breath, having run off to fetch them the minute things really started getting heated. Russell pulls at Carden's uniform meekly, suggesting to his leader that it might be best to walk all this off instead. Carden glares down the whole room silently before he tells everyone to go screw themselves and storms off, not to be seen for the rest of the volume. The tension doesn't vanish though. As Weiss makes her way out of the cafeteria and into the hallway, she's followed by Blake, Yang, and RWBY. Blake immediately opens up on Weiss, seething out. "And here you'd almost convinced me you weren't your family. I can't believe that's what you think of the Faunus." Weiss stops and turns to face Blake, leaving Yang and RWBY between them in shot, watching the argument with concern. Weiss hisses back, "And I can't believe you're defending them." Blake narrows her eyes. "Defending who? The Faunus? Defending a girl getting bullied in front of hundreds of kids?" Weiss rolls her eyes. "Bleeding hearts like you are the reason the White Fang haven't been wiped off the face of Remnant." Blake is aghast. "And why should they be?" Weiss shakes her head dismissively. Hello? They're terrorists!" Blake narrows her eyes and bites out. "Freedom fighters!" It's here that we match cut from the hallway into Team RWBY's dorm room, where the fight has continued to escalate, both arguing girls having sat on their beds across from one another. Weiss crosses her arms. "I don't understand why this is causing a problem." Blake points into Weiss's chest. "That is the problem!" Weiss stands and retorts. "You realize you're defending an organization that hates humanity, don't you? The Faunus of the White Fang are pure evil." Blake stands to match her. "People can't be pure evil. Why do you think they hate humanity so much? It's because of people like Cardin, people like you, that force the White Fang to take such drastic measures." Baffled, Weiss puts a hand to her collar. "People like me?" And Blake throws her hands in the air. "You're discriminatory!" Without missing a beat, Weiss shouts back, "I'm a victim!" Narrowing her eyes at Blake and whispering roughly, Weiss says, "You want to know why I despise the White Fang? Why I don't particularly trust the Faunus? They've been at war with my family for years. War, as in actual bloodshed. My grandfather's company has had a target painted across its back for as long as I can remember. And ever since I was a child, I've watched friends disappear, board members kidnapped, family executed. And every day my father would come home, furious, and that made for a very difficult childhood." She rounds off her monologue by slamming her fists on the room's bookshelf. RWBY attempts to comfort Weiss, but Weiss shoves her off, walking over to stare Blake down. "You want to know why I despise the Faunus? It's because they're a bunch of liars, thieves, and murderers." This finally gets Blake to crack, and she yells right into Weiss's face. "Well, maybe we were just tired of being pushed around!" There is stunned silence in the room as it slowly dawns on everyone what Blake just said. Breathing even heavier, eyes frantic, Blake bolts out the door before anyone can react. The rest of her team watch her go, too stunned to follow. We find Blake at the edge of Beacon's terrace just as night falls. Still breathing heavy from the exertion of running here, she stops and gathers her breath. With a deliberate hand, she reaches up and takes off her bow, looking at it sadly and sparing that same glance back at the spires of Beacon. Clenching her fist around the bow, she runs off into the night, ending the episode. Episode 16 picks up in Team RWBY's dorm room in the immediate aftermath of Blake's outburst, with the 3 remaining members still coming out of shock. RWBY and Yang both want to go after Blake immediately to try and bring her back, but Weiss makes that difficult, instead demanding they go to the administrative offices and report Blake as a terrorist. RWBY suggests that if Blake were still a member of the White Fang, wouldn't she have struck by now? She's had access to Weiss this entire time, a statement that makes Weiss bristle in place. Weiss counters that by suggesting that Blake was probably playing the long game, an attempt to get close to her father. Something similar happened with her uncle and her aunt's favorite servant. Yang asks why Blake would have blown her cover if that were the case. Besides, maybe if the Shnees treated their servants better, none of this would have been a problem in the first place. Weiss shouts back that their servants are paid a healthy wage, way more than they should considering her family's history with the Faunus. We leave the argument to catch up with Blake, wandering the streets of Vale before stumbling into Penny. The excitable, strange girl seems to be assisting the city with more cleaning efforts and early preparations for the first stage of the Vital Festival. Blake finds it weird, but Penny mentions that she enjoyed helping so much she decided to take it up as a part-time job, though she questions if she properly interpreted what he meant. Regardless, she asks if RWBY and Yang are with Blake, as she always has such a good time with Team RWBY around. Blake shakes her head no, and quickly excuses herself, uninterested in having a conversation with the peppy girl. Penny happily waves Blake off, and tells her not to be a stranger, though when Blake is out of earshot, Penny comedically realizes that no one actually knows where she lives. Blake arrives at a shop called Tuxon's Book Trade, and inside she's warmly greeted by the owner, a tall puma faunus named Tuxon. We learn quickly, through implications in their dialogue, that the two know each other from a shared history in the White Fang. He's surprised to see her, and even alarmed that she's apparently quit Beacon, but he nonetheless offers her his guest room, which she is grateful to take. Back at the RWBY dorm, Yang has had enough of Weiss's crap and has decided to go search for Blake. RWBY agrees to join her but insists that Yang should go get a head start. RWBY stays behind and pleads for Weiss to hear Blake's side of the story, only for Weiss to dismiss her outright and declare that she'll be taking this issue straight to Ozpin. The last statement she makes is that by the end of tomorrow, Team RWBY will be completely dismantled. With a close of the room's door, we cut to black and end the episode. A special thanks goes out to all of my wonderful patrons for supporting the channel. If you like this content and want more of it, please consider supporting it. Also consider picking up my new action-adventure novel, The Artificer, which is now available for purchase on Amazon in digital and in print. With that all said, back to your regularly scheduled fixing. Episode 17 picks back up in Tuxon's book trade. In order to repay Tuxon's kindness for sheltering her, Blake has begun working as one of his shop associates, tending to the books and manning the register. While working, she overhears a few Faunus customers gossiping about an off-the-books work offer for something big. One of the members of the conversation asks if it'll be dangerous, and the original talker waves it off, saying that all the blame is going to be pinned on the White Fang or something like that. Everyone hates those guys anyway, so what's the difference? Blake is visibly concerned, but she ultimately turns away, attempting to ignore the rumors. We cut to Weiss working her way up to Ozpin's office, bursting out of the elevator still seething. Without giving him time to even greet her, Weiss launches into a tirade asking him what kind of school he's running exactly. First incompetent leaders, and now full-blown terrorist. This school is a mockery to higher education and the entire profession of huntsman. Ozpin calmly sips his coffee, before sitting it on his desk and fixing Weiss with a stare. Starting off with a level, Miss Schnee. He explains he's been following Team RWBY's exploits and drama since almost the first day of class. They've made no shortage of problems for poor Glinda. While Weiss may be frustrated with Miss Rose, what Ozpin saw during initiation was nothing short of prodigy. Despite still retaining much of her childish enthusiasm, she has progressed quite rapidly at shedding it to fulfill her role as a healthy leader. At least, were she not dealing with an unruly and unrelenting teammate causing friction. As to Miss Belladonna, he has regularly observed her amicable personality, always willing to compromise or find a non-confrontational approach. All the more surprising if your revelations about her are correct. However, what would a member of the White Fang be doing at this academy? He continues that he personally looks into every student's background before they attend. If he finds something discordant with the cause of protecting society, he would never permit that student through the front door. With all that considered, he plays on Weiss's adherence to authority and inquires if Weiss thinks he's made a mistake. Weiss winces, knocked off kilter, and stutters out, "No, that's not what I..." Ozpin speaks over her and suggests sternly that Weiss meditate on what it means to be part of a team, especially a team that she is not in command of. Otherwise, he muses, it may be that his only mistake was admitting a certain heiress to his academy. We get a close-up of Weiss's stricken face, her eyes wide, before we cut away. This conversation is a splash of cold water to Weiss, functioning like the port conversation in the original version of The Badge and the Burden. Conceptually, the original was a good speech, but delivered much too soon for the whole Weiss-RWBY conflict to have any weight. Now the plotline has had time to breathe in the narrative, and in fact is now intertwined with a completely different plot, emphasizing Weiss's need to grow as a person. Back to the story, we cut to RWBY downtown looking for Blake. She and Yang are coordinating by scroll, but neither are having much luck, even though they've already spent almost an entire day searching. As they talk, RWBY receives a text message from Coco. The other leader is also downtown and is asking RWBY to come to a nearby cafe. The question is more of a demand, and RWBY reluctantly agrees. The two meet at the cafe, but Coco offers to walk with RWBY so we can avoid an actual cafe scene. Lord knows there's already been enough of those in this script. Coco opens up the conversation by reflecting on her history with Fox. Her previous partner died during initiation, and Fox's partner was too injured to continue a career in hunting, so the two were stuck together at the end of initiation and put on Team Coffee. Coco started her career at Beacon as a showboat, and Fox was very much a loose cannon, and they developed a competitive relationship where they were constantly trying to one-up each other. This eventually ended with Velvet and Yatsuhashi sitting them down and forcing them to actually work together. They still didn't quite get along, but as the team accrued experience and went through more and more dangerous missions together, the two began to respect one another. It took time, but by the end of their first year, Team Coffee was gaining ground where other teams were starting to falter. Her point, she says, is that it takes time for a team to acclimate, and even with the improvements RWBY is making as a leader, sometimes it's not her fault that things aren't going as planned. All she can do is try to roll with the blows until things come together. Of course, she adds, this doesn't mean Ruby can slack off and blame things on everyone else. She should always strive to improve herself. Ruby appreciates the kind words, but comments the pep talk doesn't really help her find Blake, to which Coco replies that she's not worried about Blake. From what Velvet says, Blake has a good head on her shoulders, even if it's not properly aligned quite yet. When it finally is, she'll come back to the home that Ruby and Yang have helped build for her. Ruby says that's nice to hear and all, but points out that none of that really applies to the current situation. Coco admits that she knows it really doesn't apply, but she's obligated to at least attempt to give some advice to Ruby right now, or else Osmond will be on her ass again. The only reason they were made Team Ruby's mentors in the first place was because Coco embezzled last year's dance budget on clothes for her and her own team. Ruby just says, "Oh, okay," and the scene peters out awkwardly. The last scene is of Blake in the bookstore, closing up for the night, and letting her ears out of the bow, when an unseen figure walks up behind her. She offhandedly remarks that they're closing, and the stranger replies, "I knew you would look better without the bow," prompting Blake to spin around in surprise. Yang is standing there, exhausted but smiling. Episode 18 picks up with Yang sending a message off to Ruby, reassuring Blake that all she did was make sure Ruby knew that they were both safe. She didn't tell Ruby where they were or anything beyond that. Blake thanks her for being discreet, and Yang shrugs it off, casually replying that it's the right thing to do. Analyzing what Yang said at the end of the prior episode, Blake asks if and how Yang knew about her ears. Yang answers frankly that she'd had her suspicions since they were paired up, noticing a number of different things about Blake that began to tip her off. But she figured that Blake would tell them all the truth whenever she felt the most comfortable, reinforcing that Yang is a rather observant and considerate person. Yang finally attacks the heart of the matter, asking Blake about her past, though she gives Blake an out to stop the conversation if she ever feels uncomfortable. Blake slowly, and cautiously, explains that she was once member of the White Fang, for most of her life in fact. After the Faunus revolts up in Mantle, Faunus around the globe were promised equality. Despite this, the Faunus were subjected to discrimination and hate. Humanity still thought of them as lesser beings. Back when she joined, the White Fang were seen as a symbol of peace and unity between humans and Faunus, to bring to fruition that equality the Faunus were promised. Blake was at the front of every rally, part of every boycott. She thought they were making a difference. But she was just a blind idealist. 5 years prior, the original leader of the White Fang stepped down, a leader Blake hints in the vaguest of terms she greatly respects. The new leader became more aggressive with his tactics, and even turned a blind eye to crimes being perpetrated by the lower-level protesters. She even began hearing rumors of him actively condoning their behavior as well, though she never had any confirmation. Right and wrong became less clear, and she started to question what she was doing, question the ways she was trying to help the cause. It was unnerving, and she left the White Fang because of the corruption she could feel creeping in. She saw what it did to someone she used to consider a dearly close friend, a relationship with vaguely romantic implications that turned incredibly sour at the end. After leaving, she enlisted the help of Tuxin, a sympathizer with the White Fang's cause but a critic of their radicalization. He shares Blake's disgust for the criminal element of the White Fang and understands it's healthier to help those wishing to leave the organization than stay with it himself. Yang is quiet through all this, carefully listening and absorbing what she's being told. At the end of Blake's soliloquy, she asks the obvious question: why didn't she tell her team? Or even just Yang? Blake responds that she already got burned by someone she trusted once and wasn't looking for any deep relationships at Beacon. She'd spent so much time outside of the kingdoms that it was rare for her to come across huntsmen that traveled in groups. After meeting so many lone wolves, her natural assumption was that most huntsmen operated alone. It was only after initiation began that she realized she would be stuck with someone for the next 4 years, and it left her caught between wanting to connect with someone and wanting to remain detached, explaining her fickle investment in the team. Yang just smiles and says, "When you're friends with me, we're friends for life, even if we never see each other again. It's not the distance that matters, it's the connection." Her words are light at first, but heavier, melancholic as she says the last line. For a brief moment, her eyes are hollow and her tone becomes bitter. Back with Ruby, she's receiving Yang's message and is heading back to the dorm. Before she can get into the room, however, she overhears Weiss approaching Pyrrha to talk about something. We cut closer to Weiss's perspective and see that Pyrrha is not too happy with the way Weiss handled herself in the arguments the other day, especially with her bigoted mindset laid bare to the world. Uncharacteristically, Weiss pleads a listening ear, and Pyrrha relents that she's too inclined to be nice, even when she thinks someone is wrong. The two go up to the roof, and Ruby follows along, eavesdropping. Weiss admits that she's more than confused about everything happening around her and her team. Back in Atlas, not a person would challenge her, except for her own family, and she'd left specifically to break free of them. But now, she's finding it harder and harder to connect with anyone. With even the headmaster of Beacon glaring over his glasses at her, she feels sick to her stomach with anxiety. She came to Beacon to be free, but she feels more suffocated than ever, and Pyrrha is the only person she knows who might be able to understand, since the Mistralian is her own kind of celebrity royalty. Pyrrha pulls pieces from what Weiss says to help her come to terms with those anxieties and even manages to relate with some of the same grief. There was a point in her own life where she only saw the people around her as there for her, as servants. But after an accident that Pyrrha was responsible for, some sense got knocked into her that the people around her were just that. People. She tried to take responsibility for the accident, but the PR team covered it up, even if she and the family of the injured party knew what really happened. She advises Weiss to look at people as her equals before anything else. Human, Faunus, it doesn't matter. If she wants to fix the mess between her and her team, she'll need to humble herself, just like she is now with Pyrrha. She could be as skilled and well-trained as she wants. No one wants to work with, let alone talk to, someone who's pompous and ungrateful. Pyrrha looks to the door to the roof knowingly, having been aware of Ruby's presence the entire time, earning a quiet meep from the team leader. Beckoning Ruby over with a smile, she tells Weiss that maybe the first thing she needs to do to get on that path is to learn how to apologize. Ruby meekly walks out onto the roof as Pyrrha makes her way to the door. Before she leaves, she throws back an implicit invitation to the two, saying that Ren plans to make Nora some pancakes and no one wants to miss out on that. Left on the roof alone, Ruby and Weiss lock eyes. After a moment of silence, Ruby weakly says, "Hi." Cut to black, end of episode. The finale of the volume is actually 2 episodes fused together into one big episode, to give us the most amount of time to work with. The episode opens with Torchwick and Neo overseeing a small fleet of bullheads, all neatly lined up inside a large hangar. He turns to a collection of thieves wearing white fang disguises and orders them to move out. Roman thumbs through a pamphlet for the Vital Festival, every page branded with images of priceless art, and he makes the snide remark, "I always was a big fan of the classics." We snap back to Ruby and Weiss, who are still staring awkwardly at each other. Ruby says they should probably sit down, and Weiss, emotionally drained, agrees. The two slowly, almost painfully apologize to each other, Weiss for being so unruly and disrespectful, and Ruby for being so childish. Ruby admits that it's hard being a good leader, and Weiss adds, self-deprecatingly, that it doesn't help when the subordinates don't listen. Ruby shakes her head, saying she doesn't look to her teammates as subordinates. Every member of Team RWBY is equal, all with their own strengths and weaknesses, and she admires that about everyone. Yang's strong and has a big heart, Blake's stealthy and level-headed, a comment that makes Weiss wince. And Ruby ends it off saying that Weiss is smart and confident. Pulling into herself, Ruby explains she's envious of them all. She just feels like an uncoordinated kid who cheated herself by skipping 2 years ahead. Weiss quietly digests those words, letting Ruby finish. After a brief moment of silence, Weiss says, "I don't think that's true. You're a klutz. You're annoyingly energetic. You've got no attention span." Ruby blinks at Weiss, confused at all of the insults. She drawls out, "But..." before Weiss finishes off, "But you've got talent. You're an incredible fighter and occasionally you come up with a good idea, even if they are all insane. I guess what I'm trying to say is you shouldn't doubt yourself so much. And as your partner, I shouldn't have fed into that." There's a moment of silence before Ruby abruptly says, "Okay then." She stands, brushes herself off, and holds her hand down to Weiss. "Let's start over." Weiss looks hesitantly up at Ruby's hand before taking it and standing as well. Coughing into her other hand, Ruby hops on her heels and says, "Hello there! I'm Ruby Rose, and I'll be your team leader and partner for the next 4 years. Weiss cracks a smile and reintroduces herself. "I'm Weiss Schnee, and from this point forward, I'll be the best partner you'll ever have." The bold response gets Ruby to raise a brow. "But you're the only partner I'll ever have." Weiss stomps her foot and says, "You know what I mean." There's a beat of silence before the two break down laughing, the first genuine laugh shared between them in the series. When they calm down, Weiss asks about Blake, though it's clear that even with this changing character, she's uneasy about Blake's history. Ruby answers that Yang found her, though she went quiet so they could talk things out. Weiss is equal parts relieved and on edge by the news. Ruby says that she's confident Yang can handle things, suggesting, "We'll probably see them again in the morning." Instead, RWBY remarks that Pyrrha definitely just invited them to free pancakes, so why not take her up on the offer? Weiss is skeptical about pancakes at night, but RWBY talks her into it, and the two head off to Juniper's dorm room. Back at Tuckson's, Blake and Yang are settling in for the night, with Yang sleeping on Tuckson's couch. During some amiable conversation, the topic of the White Fang crops up, and Blake mentions hearing rumor that the White Fang are suddenly committing more crimes inside of Vale. The news hadn't quite reached Beacon's rumor mill, and it probably didn't help she actively avoided anything White Fang related while at school. However, she thought it was odd that the White Fang would do any kind of terrorist work while in Vale, since it was arguably one of the most amicable kingdoms towards the Faunus. It makes her wonder if what she overheard about them being framed was true. Tucson joins them and chimes in, not surprised that Blake's heard the rumors as well. Someone is trying to frame the White Fang. While she doesn't agree with the White Fang's methods, Blake is worried that these crimes are going to further damage the public's perception of the Faunus and push the White Fang to radicalize even more. Yang proposes the idea of clearing the White Fang's name, suggesting that the only way to prove they didn't do the crime is to go to the place where they would most likely go if they were to do it, and not find them there. Right? Blake and Tucson both blink at Yang's logic, actually giving them pause, before Tucson comments that there are priceless mantle art pieces being shipped in for the Vital Festival. We, as an audience, can key into how precious these pieces are, because the destruction of art and mantle was already brought up during history class back in episode 12. Yang and Blake set out to investigate the docks where the art is being sent, intent to stop a suspected potential maybe crime from happening. Before they leave, Yang shoots a message to RWBY, telling her what they're planning to do. We briefly cut back to RWBY, mid-pancakes with Juniper and Weiss, who all seem to be reconciling slowly, with Nora still glaring Weiss down and Pyrrha pointedly sitting between the two of them awkwardly. RWBY's scroll pings with Yang's message and she flips it open to read. Her eyes bug out after reading it, and she grabs Weiss before booking it out the door. There's a moment of befuddlement as Juniper watches them go, before Nora just shrugs it off and begins eating Weiss's pancakes. When Yang and Blake arrive at the docks, they find the guards and workers unconscious or dead, and the place crawling with White Fang imposters. Blake also sees Torchwick among them, yelling instructions. Enraged, she breaks away from Yang without a word and sneaks over to hold Roman hostage. She outs herself in the process, and she uses the opportunity to plead to the Faunus and the crowd of robbers, asking them to think about what they're doing, smearing the reputation of the White Fang. One or two give pause, but most are unimpressed by her little speech. Torchwick laughs her off. What reputation? And he uses the gun in his cane to escape, kickstarting a fight between himself, his men, Blake and Yang. Yang proves herself the awesome powerhouse we saw in the Yellow trailer, taking on the bulk sum of the robbers and kicking the living crap out of just about every one of them. In fact, during the fight, Torchwick remarks that he's sure he saw her at Junior's bar before heading out the door, clearly amused by the coincidence. During all of this, RWBY and Weiss are rushing to back up Yang and Blake using RWBY's speed semblance. During a pause to catch their breaths, RWBY sees Yang take damage on the Team Aura readout on her scroll. And as a nice additional touch, Blake's status is unavailable because she shut her scroll off to prevent anyone from tracking her. Spurred onward by Yang being in danger, the two push themselves even faster, before they literally run into Penny, accidentally bowling her over. The three stand, and RWBY asks, "Penny, what are you doing here?" And she replies, "I'm helping set up for the Vital Festival." Weiss angrily says, "At night?" Penny is about to respond, but RWBY interrupts her, saying, "We don't have time, we have to get to the docks." Penny is curious as to why, and RWBY quickly catches her up to speed that Yang and Blake are in danger. Penny claps her hands happily. "Yang found Blake? Stupendous! She was looking for Blake earlier and I tried to point her in the right direction." Weiss groans and suggests they leave, and RWBY agrees. Penny hops on her heels. "I can help." RWBY shakes her head. "No, Penny, it's going to be dangerous." And Penny gives an excitable thumbs up. "No need to worry, I'm combat ready!" RWBY seems torn and Weiss pinches her brow, before dragging RWBY towards the docks. Exasperated, Weiss groans. "This weirdo can do whatever she wants. We gotta get to the docks." Penny begins following after and asks chipperly, "Should I call the authorities?" And Weiss responds, "Yeah, sure, whatever." Cutting back to the docks, Blake and Yang have taken out most of the ground forces, leaving Torchwick alone. He manages to hold off Blake, but Yang proves overpowering, until one of his bullheads arrive to deliver Neo. The girl drops down to deflect one of Yang's blows with an umbrella, her form shattering upon impact as Yang destroys a physical illusion created by Neo's semblance, Looking Glass. This is the first confrontation between Yang and Neo, and will go a long way towards establishing their rivalry that was never really elaborated upon after the original Volume 2. The fight devolves into Yang versus Neo and Blake versus Torchwick, with the two Beacon girls seemingly outclassed by the criminals at every turn. Torchwick eventually gets the upper hand on Blake, so much so that we see her aura flaring, which we know from previous fights means she's almost out of juice. He fires an explosive shot at her, an attack that might gravely injure her or even kill her, only for it to be blocked by a wall of ice. Blake looks up to find Weiss and Ruby, both out of breath from rushing, standing defensively in front of her. Blake is happy to see Ruby, but confused to see Weiss, who simply says they'll talk about it when they get out of this mess alive. Team RWBY finally comes together in an Avengers-esque shot, followed shortly by some light banter between Ruby and Torchwick when they recognize each other. Yang mentions how slippery Neo is, and Ruby formulates a plan. She tells Weiss and Blake to go after Neo, or Snowcone as Yang nicknamed her, while Yang and herself will handle Torchwick, a strategy that ends with them gaining significant territory on the criminal duo. 3 other bullheads show up and begin firing down at the team, to the point that Weiss is having difficulty maintaining defensive ice walls. Penny finally steps into the fight, having seemed hesitant the entire confrontation. She unleashes a series of floating swords from her backpack and jumps forward to blow the ever-living crap out of each bullhead. Careening out of control, they crash into some nearby buildings. Ruby is about to run off and make sure the people inside the buildings are safe, only for Penny to inform her that the buildings are abandoned. There's no need for concern. Realizing the situation has gone south, Torchwick hops on the last of his bullheads with Neo, and the two try to escape. Penny, however, tracks them and shoots down the airship, crashing it into the buildings as well. After all the damage sustained from crashing airships, the building collapses in on itself, just as the authorities begin to arrive. The assembled Team RWBY all breathe a sigh of relief. Time cuts forward a bit when all 4 of our protagonists are getting treated for their wounds. Blake tries to explain herself, telling Weiss that she's no longer part of the White Fang, but she's also not going to stop fighting for what she believes in. Weiss cuts her off, saying, "I've had 24 hours and 6 minutes to think this all over. And I've decided, I don't care." Blake blinks in surprise, asking, "You don't care?" Weiss asks back, "You said you left, haven't you?" Blake nods, trying to elaborate, but Weiss shushes her. I don't want to hear it. That's all in the past. Just know that in the future..." Weiss looks off to the side uncomfortably. "You have teammates." Blake cautiously asks, "So are we good?" Weiss sighs and offers a weak smile. "Yeah, we're good." Ruby looks between them excitedly before cheering, "Yeah! Team RWBY is back together!" The entire team look at Ruby with mixed levels of exasperation, but then Ruby quickly wonders how they're going to explain all that property damage to the authorities. She turns to ask Penny her opinion, only to notice that Penny is missing. The last shot we have of Team RWBY for the season is from the car Penny is being driven away in, her guardian chiding her for such a ridiculous interpretation of protocol. We cut to Ozpin, sipping his coffee and going over the incoming reports about Team RWBY and the docks. He's smiling with amusement, only for it to drop when he gets a message from Crow about the Queen having pawns. Cut to black, roll credits. In an after-credits scene, we see that Roman and Neo survive the crash, along with a few of his henchmen, having landed inside an abandoned train station. They're trapped in an underground tunnel that has partially collapsed, and are trying to find a way out that doesn't require hoofing it down the tracks. However, several other people wearing different, more official-looking White Fang outfits hold them up. Roman tries ordering them around, only for one of his men to say, "Those guys aren't with us." It clicks for Roman that these are actual White Fang, and in a devilishly ironic twist, they've been captured by the real terrorist organization. Roman can't help but laugh. He ain't even mad. When one of the Fang members suggests killing the imposters, along with Torchwick and Neo, a new female voice turns them down, saying, "Why waste a perfectly good pawn?" The scene lingers only so long as a feminine hand captured in flame rises into the foreground, before being snuffed out to a black screen, setting the scene for Volume 2.